drilling down into a bit more on the details. Yeah. For Section 5 leadership, you have to include information security objectives in the policy. So if you notice in the 2013 version, they have a list of information security objectives that you have to include. For example, it needs to align with your policy, it needs to have some measurable controls, and so on and so on. It's about half a page long. Yeah. On planning, on risk assessment, you have to have these outcomes and some of the components like onus, criteria, prioritization, and comparison to the previous risk assessments done. So if you already have this in place, great. But these are the new ones that haven't been explicitly mentioned in the originating level. Okay. Risk owner's approval of the risk treatment plan. I'm sure some of you have already, have this kind of governance in place already, but you have to again go ahead and check on that gap and establish the information security objectives, including metrics to measure this. Okay. Moving on to support. This is more on competency than anything else. To develop relevant competency and implement controls to measure the effectiveness. And of course, to maintain the controls for the documentation. More on retention on this one. Okay. Similarly, for operations, it's also on documentation, specific to risk treatments. Okay. So this is the biggest chunk of the gap on performance evaluation. In MTCS, some of the levels we already mentioned to include ISO 27001 version 2013. But some of the levels do not have this requirement. So this is one of the things that you need to look at. In terms of internal audit results, it is mandatory to report the relevant management as per defined in the policy. And the components that must be included in the management review include areas such as status from previous management reviews, changes in relevant external and internal issues, and feedback on the overall ISMS performance. Okay, so far so good? Alright, so in terms of improvement, again, a bit more on documentation, but in this case, it's specific to non-conformities, corrective actions taken, and the corresponding results. Okay. If you can recall, in version 2013, we also have Annex A. Yeah. So in the Annex section, we only have 3 sections with gaps, A8, A9, and A18 on asset management, access control, and compliance. So this one is more specific on the area of information classification policy and procedures. While we are all aware that you probably have the information classification policy, but the requirement states that it needs to support asset classification based on the importance to the organization. So it's slightly more stringent on that. On access control, you need to define a specific access control policy for all the information and application system functions granted only to authorized personnel. This is quite high level because it's a summary, but if you go through the requirements, you'll notice that there are more specific requirements included. In terms of compliance, to implement controls and ensure privacy and protection of the personal data. So this is more aligned to the recently released PDPA. Okay. Any questions so far? Okay, all good. So we're going to move on to some of the scenarios and examples on how to use the document more efficiently, because as and when you go into the reports, you probably wonder, why is it this way, and what happens if this is the gap that I get for this particular clause. So scenario 1. No gaps identified between ISO and MTCS level 1. So in this case, in the gap analysis, even though there are no gaps identified, we will still include this clause and mark it as included, right? But as you go on to the implementation guideline and audit checklist, this particular clause will no longer be included in the respective documents. So don't be alarmed if you don't find this particular clause in the next two documents. Okay. Here's a snapshot. So if you go to section 9 of the report, this is the exact snapshot of the table. So in this case, if you're looking at section 5 leadership, subsection 5.2 policy, and clause 1A, it's included. So it will be mentioned in the gap analysis report. So these are the three columns where we have reference to the matching MTCS sections, the subsections in MTCS, and remarks on the gap. So in this case, while we are aware that information security policy in clause 6.4 MTCS is able to establish the direction of the organization, the inclusion of information security objectives in the policy is not explicitly mentioned. So this is just a summary on the components that are missing from the policy. Okay. So this is what the gap analysis looks like. But if you go into the implementation guideline report, you notice it starts with 5, 5.2, and then only 1B is included. 1A is no longer in the report. Okay. Similarly, in the audit checklist report, you can only find 1B, 1A not included. Okay. Scenario 2. Identified gap is common across all three levels of MTCS against ISO. So what does this mean? Level 1, 2, and 3, we have this particular clause classified as either new or incremental. Right. Just a bit of background on the gaps. So we have three gaps. This information is available in the report, the introduction bit. But we have three gap classifications. So one is included, one is incremental, and one is new. So if it's included, you can ignore it. However, we do have notes in the remarks column if you want to refer to them. But for incremental and new, are the gaps identified for further audit process or further observation by the CSPs. Okay. So what does this mean and how does it look like? For 5.2 para 1B, we do not have any levels mentioned here. Hence, you can assume that this particular clause is a gap for all MTCS levels. Yeah. Similarly, the remarks is not broken down into the respective levels because it's common across all three levels. So how does the implementation guideline look like? It's also just one particular point for that clause. So what we pull out from 5.2 just now is the gap classification. So in this case, it's incremental. It's not new or included. And what is it that you need to look at? So while we talk about information security policy, you also need to include information security objectives. So here is a bit more description on how you can do that. So in this case, provide a framework to develop the information security objectives or include it in your policy. Yeah? And for details, you can refer to this particular clause in the standard 6.2. Okay. Now the audit checklist. This is a bit different. While the implementation guideline is quite straightforward, you only have one remarks, right? But I'm sure the certification bodies and the auditors here are quite familiar with this, but just to give you a bit of a background on the three columns that we have in the audit checklist. First, we have the organizational control. So in this case, you would do the usual. You need to review reports, documentations, and whatnot. And you need to make sure that the roles and responsibilities are clearly defined. So these are just guidelines that you can follow. in terms of technical control and visual control review, this is more on inspection of system or the physical inspection of controls. Yeah? So I'm also sure you are quite familiar with this. Alright. So let's move on to scenario 3. So this particular scenario, we have gaps identified between ISO and level 1 and 2. So as such, if you are level 3 certified, you don't have to do any, you don't have to address any gaps. Yeah? Specific to this example is clause 7.5.3. So let's look at the detail. So remember just now I mentioned some clauses will have split rows, some will just have one row. So this is an example where level 1 and 2, these are incrementals, but level 3 is included. So you'll see this in the report. Yeah. So in the details, we will highlight what are the differences based on these different levels. So while there are elements of storage and data protection in MTCS, details of storage protection, redundancy and testing are not mentioned in sufficient details except for in level 3. So these are the clauses that you need to look at. So you'll have enough ammo to go ahead and decide on what's next. Okay. So for level 1 and 2, you will still see them. You will still see them in the implementation guideline. So that's why we still have that, and we will still have our recommendations on the steps that you need to take as a CSP. Okay. Similarly, for the audit checklist, we will also include the details here on our recommendation on what to include in the cross-certification exercise. Just to highlight, you will see that these 3 columns may have multiple checks. So some of those, if it's level 3, you probably have 1, 2, 3, or 1 here and another 1 here. For level 1 and 2, generally, it will just be either this or these 2. Depends on which clause we're talking about. Okay, next example. Gaps identified between ISO and level 1. So while the other one is gap for level 1 and 2, here is only for level 1. So we do have this scenario as well in the report. So the example here is 6.1.2 and 1E1 for 6.1.2 and 1E2 for 6.1.2. So cumulatively, you could also see this example in the report. Level 1 incremental, level 2 included, level 3 included. The same example here. And of course, you can see in the remarks column, we will highlight what is specific to which level. So this one is level 2, this one is level 1, similarly level 1 here and level 2 here. Okay. And the ones with the gaps, again, we will carry it forward to the implementation guideline. So you may also see this scenario where for 6.1.2, because they are closely linked together in terms of IS risk assessment, right? So even for these 2 different clauses, sometimes the examples or the guidelines are embedded within one cell. So it's because they are quite interconnected, so we put them under one cell. The same thing for audit checklist. As you can see, you have 2 clauses here, but we only have 1 box. Yeah. So this is the example that I mentioned just now. It's like level 1 is very simple and straightforward. You just have to review the documents, the reports, and conduct interviews.